Sign the land over, or we put the dog down. They mocked the old veteran for inheriting a useless patch of sharp lava rock. But the laughter stopped when a desperate rescue mission into a dark hole revealed a glowing green secret that would change history. When the world discards you as worthless, do you surrender, or do you find the treasure hidden inside? Welcome to Veteran Honor Chronicles. Please consider subscribing and turning on the notification bell to honor the resilient spirit of our heroes. Now, let's join Scott and Gunnar on the Black Patch. The air conditioning in the high-rise office of Wright & Associates was set to a temperature that felt more like a morgue than a place of business. It was a sterile, aggressive cold that seemed designed to keep the tropical heat of Honolulu at bay, along with anyone who did not belong there. Scott Parker definitely did not belong there. He shifted uncomfortably in the high-backed leather chair, acutely aware of the way the fine grain of the seat stuck to his dusty canvas trousers. He ran a hand through his hair, which was pulled back in a silver ponytail at the nape of his neck, and adjusted the collar of his faded olive field jacket. It was a garment that had seen better decades, much like the man wearing it. At his feet lay Gunnar. The old German shepherd rested his heavy head on his front paws, his breathing slow and rhythmic. Every few minutes, the dog would let out a soft whistling sigh and shift his weight, trying to find a comfortable position for his bad hip on the plush carpet. Across the polished mahogany table sat Marcus and Bradley Parker. They looked as if they had been cut from the same bolt of expensive Italian cloth, smelling of heavy cologne and unearned confidence. They checked their gold watches repeatedly, making no effort to hide their boredom. To them, this was just a transaction, a final bit of paperwork before they could claim their due. Simon Wright, the executor of the estate, cleared his throat. The sound was dry and sharp in the quiet room. He adjusted his spectacles and began to read the final wishes of Ezekiel Parker. The reading was swift and brutal in its disparity. To Marcus went the beachfront properties in Maui and the commercial real estate in downtown Honolulu. To Bradley went the diversified stock portfolio and the liquid assets, totaling a sum that made Scott blink in disbelief. The cousins exchanged satisfied smirks, the kind of smiles that did not reach their eyes. Then came the final bequest. Simon hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes darting to Scott before returning to the document. To his nephew Scott, Ezekiel Parker left the deed to Lot Number 4, located in Lava Zone 1 on the southern slopes of Mauna Loa. A stifled laugh broke the silence. Marcus covered his mouth, but his eyes were dancing with mockery. He leaned over to Bradley and whispered loud enough for the room to hear. He called it the Black Patch. He said it was a place where the earth was so broken and sharp that even the wild goats broke their legs trying to cross it. It was 20 acres of black rock, sulfur vents, and nothing else. Scott said nothing. He stared at his calloused hands, listening to the hum of the ventilation system. He had expected nothing, so receiving a wasteland felt strangely appropriate. He reached down under the table to stroke the soft gray fur between Gunnar's ears. The dog leaned into his touch, offering a silent comfort that was worth more than any beachfront condo. Bradley noticed the movement and curled his lip in disgust. He smoothed the lapel of his suit and looked at Scott with a mixture of pity and disdain. He remarked that with an inheritance of volcanic rock, Scott would hardly be able to feed himself, let alone a crippled beast. He suggested, with a cold and casual practicality, that it would be the humane thing to have the animal put down. He argued that it would save money in the long run. The air in the room seemed to vanish. The rhythmic tapping of Marcus's finger on the table stopped. Scott slowly tightened his grip on the leather leaf. The leather creaked under the pressure. He looked up, and for the first time since entering the room, the tired, worn-out expression was gone. In its place was a sharp, dangerous glint that belonged to a much younger man, a man who had survived things these soft cousins could not imagine. He spoke quietly, but his voice carried the weight of iron. He told Bradley that Gunnar was a soldier. He said the dog had more character in his bad leg than Bradley had in his entire bank account. Gunnar seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere. A low, rumbling growl began deep in his chest, vibrating through the floor, though the dog did not stand up. The cousins recoiled slightly, their arrogance faltering for a moment. They gathered their papers quickly, muttering about appointments and wasted time, and hurried out of the office without a backward glance. Scott stood up, his knees popping with the effort. He signaled Gunnar to heel, and the old dog struggled to his feet, favoring his left hind leg. Scott prepared to leave, ready to face the long drive to the ferry, but Simon Wright called out his name. The lawyer waited until the heavy oak doors had clicked shut, ensuring they were truly alone. Then he opened a drawer in his desk and slid a thick cream-colored envelope across the polished wood. Simon whispered that Ezekiel had insisted Scott receive this privately. Scott took the envelope. It felt heavy in his hand. On the front, written in shaky, failing script, were words that made Scott's breath catch in his throat. "Open only when you intend to surrender." He looked at the lawyer, but Simon only gave a small, solemn nod. Scott tucked the letter into the inside pocket of his field jacket, right next to his heart. He patted Gunnar's side, and together the two discarded soldiers walked out of the cool, artificial air of the law firm and into the harsh, blinding reality of the afternoon sun. The ascent from the tropical warmth of the coast to the barren saddle between the volcanoes was a journey into another world. Here, at an elevation that made the air thin and biting, the lush green of the islands vanished, replaced by a monochrome landscape of charcoal and gray. This was the Black Patch, a stretch of land that looked less like a home and more like the aftermath of a war. A thick, acrid haze hung low over the lava fields. The locals called it VOG, a volcanic smog that drifted from the active vents, carrying the scent of sulfur and old earth. It stung the eyes and settled deep in the lungs, a constant reminder that the mountain beneath them was merely sleeping, not dead. Scott Parker coughed, a dry hacking sound that echoed in the small tin-roofed shack he now called home. The structure was a patchwork of rusted corrugated metal and weathered plywood, trembling slightly with every gust of the high-altitude wind. It was ugly, drafty, and isolated, but it was theirs. Every morning began with a ritual born of necessity. Scott knelt on the rough plywood floor, his joints popping in the damp cold. Gunnar sat before him, patient but stiff. The old German shepherd watched Scott with milky, trusting eyes as the man produced 4 small boots made of heavy canvas and duct tape. Outside, the ground was a nightmare of lava. The rocks were jagged, brittle, and sharp as broken glass. A single misstep could slice a paw pad to the bone. Scott lifted Gunnar's front left paw, handling the limb with a tenderness that belied his rough appearance. He slipped the canvas boot over the dog's foot and secured the laces, checking the tension to ensure it was snug but not tight. He repeated the process for all 4 paws. It was a tedious task, taking 20 minutes every dawn, but Scott never rushed. He knew the pain of walking on broken ground, and he would not let his partner suffer it. Once the boots were secured, they ventured out into the gray morning. The wind whipped at Scott's olive jacket as he made his way toward the water catchment system. Water was precious here, harvested from the fog and the rain, and the old gutters needed constant maintenance. It was during one of these treks, searching for a leak in the rusted piping further up the ridge, that Scott stumbled upon the ruins. Hidden behind a ridge of solidified magma lay a pile of dark stones. To an untrained eye, it might have looked like a random rockfall, but Scott noticed the intention in the debris. The stones were smooth, river rocks that had been carried up the mountain from miles away, distinct from the jagged lava. They had once formed a structure, a small altar or shrine, now toppled by the relentless wind. Scott paused, wiping the sweat and grit from his forehead. He was exhausted. The thin air made every movement an effort, and his back ached from the cold. He should have kept moving, focused on the water line. But something about the fallen stones bothered him. It felt like disrespect. It felt like a grave left untended. He set his tools down. For the next 2 hours, Scott worked in silence. He lifted the heavy, smooth stones, finding their original placements by instinct and feel. He restacked them carefully, building a stable, respectful cairn that stood defiant against the gray sky. He did not know it was a heiau, a sacred Hawaiian shrine, nor did he know the prayers that belonged to it. He simply knew that some things deserved to stand upright. He did not see the figure standing in the shifting mists 100 yards away. Keone Mahalona, his white hair damp with the fog, leaned against a twisted ohia tree. The old kahu watched the stranger, the man the town called a squatter and a madman, repairing the sacred site with the reverence of a believer. Keone remained silent, his dark eyes narrowing in thought as he watched the intruder honor a history that was not his own. By the time night fell, the temperature had plummeted. Inside the shack, the only light came from the orange glow of a cast-iron wood stove. Scott sat in a rickety chair, breaking a piece of stale bread in half. He tossed one portion to Gunner, who caught it with a snap of his jaws, before settling down on a rug near the heat. Scott chewed his own piece slowly, staring into the flames. The wind howled outside, a lonely, mournful sound that rattled the metal walls. He reached down and rested his hand on Gunner's neck. The dog leaned his weight against Scott's leg, letting out a long, contented exhale. They were two broken soldiers, discarded by the world below, finding the only warmth that mattered in the silence of the dead lands. The morning air was unusually still, though the volcanic smog hung heavier than usual, painting the horizon in bruised shades of purple and gray. Scott Parker stood near the edge of his property, tightening the canvas straps on his backpack. Beside him, Gunner sniffed the air, his ears pricked forward. Despite his limp and the gray muzzle, the old dog still possessed the heart of a working animal, always scanning for intruders on their desolate perimeter. It happened in the blink of an eye. A nene goose, rare and startled, burst from behind a cluster of lava rocks, its wings beating frantically against the heavy air. The movement triggered an instinct, deep within Gunner, that age had not erased. Forgetting his bad hip, forgetting the treacherous terrain, the German shepherd bolted. Scott shouted a command to halt, but his voice was swallowed by the vast emptiness of the lava field. Gunner scrambled over the jagged ridges, his canvas boots gaining traction where bare paws would have failed. But the nene flew over a deceptively flat patch of ground, known to the locals as Devil's Eye Drop. It was a skylight, a fragile crust of cooled lava roofing a hollow tube beneath. Gunner lunged, his front paws hitting the crust. The rock gave way with a sickening, crumbling sound. There was no bark, only the terrifying noise of stone grinding against stone, followed by a heavy, dull impact from deep below. Then, silence. Scott ran, his chest heaving. He reached the edge of the jagged hole, a dark maw opening into the earth. He dropped to his knees, ignoring the sharp rocks tearing at his trousers, and peered into the abyss. From the darkness, a low, pained whimper drifted up. It was a sound that tore through Scott's heart more violently than any bullet ever could. Panic rose in his throat, constricted immediately by the Vogue. His lungs seized. He wheezed, clutching his chest, the familiar tightening of an asthma attack threatening to cripple him. He fumbled for his inhaler, taking a deep, desperate drag. He could not afford to be weak. Not now. He ran back to the shack, his vision swimming, and grabbed his climbing rope and emergency kit. Returning to the hole, he anchored the line to a sturdy ancient ironwood tree. The descent was a nightmare. The walls of the lava tube were lined with obsidian shards that sliced at his arms and face as he lowered himself into the gloom. His breath came in ragged gasps, every inhalation burning with sulfur and dust. His boots touched the floor of the cavern. It was cool and damp. He unhooked the rope and scrambled toward the dark shape lying on a pile of rubble. Gunnar was alive. The dog lay on his side, his breathing shallow, licking a gash on his shoulder. Scott fell beside him, his hands trembling as he checked for broken bones. Gunnar let out a soft groan and licked the blood from Scott's hand. The relief that washed over Scott was so profound it nearly brought him to his knees. Scott clicked on his heavy-duty flashlight to examine the dog's injuries more closely. He swept the beam around the chamber to check for stability. The light played across the cavern walls, settling on the area where Gunnar had struck during his fall. The impact had shattered a section of the outer basalt crust, revealing something hidden within the rock itself. The beam of light did not just reflect, it seemed to ignite the wall. A ghostly olive-green glow erupted from the fractured stone. Scott froze, the flashlight shaking in his grip. Embedded in the dark volcanic rock was a massive pocket of crystals, a xenolith structure that had been carried up from the mantle eons ago. They were raw peridot crystals, large and transparent, glittering like the eyes of ancient dragons in the darkness. It was a fortune sitting in the heart of the dead earth. But Scott did not reach for the gems. He did not calculate their value or think of the life they could buy him. He turned the light back to his dog. He buried his face in Gunnar's dusty neck, sobbing uncontrollably. The tears cut clean tracks through the grime on his face. In the cold dark of the lava tube, surrounded by millions of dollars in emerald fire, Scott Parker wept only for the miracle that his best friend was still breathing. The mistake had been born of desperation. In his panic to secure pain medication and antibiotics for Gunnar's injuries, Scott had driven into Hilo with nothing but his anxiety and a single, small fragment of the greenstone he had found in the lava tube. He had shown it to an old jeweler he trusted, asking for a loan, but eyes were always watching in a small town. The whisper of emerald fire had traveled faster than the wind across the Pacific. 2 days later, the silence of the saddle road was shattered. Scott was changing the dressing on Gunnar's leg when the low rumble of heavy engines vibrated through the floorboards of the shack. He looked out the clouded window to see a line of 3 black SUVs navigating the treacherous gravel path that led to his property. They moved like a funeral procession, dark and ominous against the gray landscape. Gunnar let out a low, warning growl, trying to stand, but Scott placed a gentle hand on the dog's shoulder to keep him down. Scott grabbed his walking stick and stepped out onto the porch, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The vehicles came to a halt in a cloud of dust. Doors opened in unison. Marcus and Bradley Parker stepped out, looking pristine and predatory in their tailored suits, undeterred by the biting mountain air. But they were not alone. From the third vehicle stepped a woman with a severe face and a clipboard, wearing a beige windbreaker that looked official and impersonal. Marcus approached the porch, stopping just short of the stairs. He looked at the shack with open disgust before turning his gaze to Scott. He stated that they had received disturbing reports about Scott's welfare and the safety of the animal in his care. Scott gripped his staff tighter, demanding to know what they wanted. Bradley stepped forward, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. He introduced the woman as Ms. Linda Crouch from Adult Protective Services. Linda Crouch did not smile. She clicked her pen and began checking boxes on her form without even looking at Scott. She recited a litany of violations in a monotone voice. No running water, no electricity, hazardous structural integrity, isolation. Then she looked up, her eyes cold. She declared that based on the evidence, Scott Parker was demonstrating clear signs of mental incompetence and self-neglect. Scott felt the blood drain from his face. He argued that he was fine, that he was living his life on his own terms. Bradley interrupted, dropping the pretense. He placed a document on the railing of the porch. It was a transfer of deed for the property, signing everything over to the Parker Group. Bradley leaned in, his voice dropping to a sinister whisper. He offered a choice. Scott could sign the land over immediately. If he did, they would arrange a comfortable room for him in a state nursing home. Scott looked at the paper, then back at his cousins. He refused. He told them to get off his land. Linda Crouch cleared her throat. She added the final weight to the scale. She stated that if Scott was deemed incompetent and removed by the state, the German Shepherd, having been reported as aggressive and injured, would be seized. Due to his age and condition, she had the authority to order immediate euthanasia. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Scott looked through the open door at Gunnar, who was watching him with trusting amber eyes. They would kill him. They would kill his only friend just to get to the stones beneath the earth. Scott's hand trembled violently. The fight drained out of him, replaced by a cold, suffocating terror. He could not let Gunnar die. He reached for the pen Bradley was holding out, his vision blurring with tears of defeat. The tip of the pen touched the paper. Then he felt a heaviness in the inside pocket of his jacket. The letter. His hand froze. The ink bled into a small dark spot on the signature line. Slowly, Scott withdrew the pen. With shaking fingers, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the cream-colored envelope Simon Wright had given him. Bradley scoffed, asking what he was doing. Scott ignored him. He tore the seal. The paper inside was old and brittle. He unfolded it, and the handwriting of Ezekiel Parker stared back at him. "Don't let them win. I didn't leave you this land to punish you, Scott. I chose you because you know how to protect sacred things. You are the guardian." A sudden warmth flooded Scott's chest, dispelling the cold terror. He was a soldier, he was a protector, and he was currently standing on his own ground. Scott looked up. The fear in his eyes was gone, replaced by the steel of a man who had nothing left to lose. He crumpled the transfer deed in his fist and threw it at Bradley's feet. The stalemate on the porch was broken by the arrival of a sheriff's cruiser, summoned by Linda Crouch to enforce the emergency removal order. 2 deputies stepped out, their hands hovering near their belts, looking uncomfortable with the tension radiating from the standoff. Bradley Parker smiled, a triumphant, oily expression that suggested he had already won the game. He gestured for the officers to take the old man away. Scott stood like a statue, the letter from his uncle clutched in his hand, Gunner limping to his side to press against his leg. Scott prepared himself for the indignity of handcuffs, for the end of his fight. But before the deputies could ascend the stairs, a different sound filled the air. It was not the roar of luxury engines, but the rattling, rhythmic hum of a dozen rusted pickup trucks and jeeps coming up the mountain road. They navigated the treacherous lava rock with practiced ease, surrounding the pristine black SUVs of the Parker cousins. Doors opened and a crowd of locals stepped out. They were not armed with weapons, but they carried a weight of presence that was far more intimidating. At the front of the group walked Keone Mahalona. The old Kahu leaned on a polished staff of koa wood, his face stern and lined like the cliffs of the coast. Bradley demanded to know who they were, his voice cracking slightly. Keone ignored him. He walked straight to the porch, past the stunned deputies, and looked at Scott. He nodded once, a gesture of profound respect. Then he turned to face the intruders. His voice was low, yet it carried over the wind without effort. He declared that Scott Parker was under the protection of the local council. Linda Crouch attempted to assert her authority, waving her clipboard, but Keone silenced her with a raised hand. He announced that the caves beneath this land had been identified as a significant cultural site. He told them that he had watched Scott Parker tend to the fallen shrines of the ancestors when no one was watching. He declared that the spirits of the land had accepted Scott as the Kahu, the guardian of this place. Keone produced a document of his own, stamped with the official seal of the Historic Preservation Division. He stated that the lava tube system was now designated as Kapu, sacred and forbidden ground. Any industrial mining permits the Parker Group hoped to acquire were effectively void. To disturb the earth here would be a federal crime. The color drained from Marcus Parker's face. He looked at the angry faces of the villagers, then at the implacable deputies who were now backing away, realizing the jurisdictional nightmare they had walked into. A public battle against indigenous rights and a disabled veteran was a scandal that would destroy their stock value overnight. Without a word, Marcus signaled to his brother. They retreated to their vehicles, their engines sounding like whining beasts as they fled down the mountain, followed by the silent, watchful gaze of the community. In the quiet that followed, Scott did not become a mining tycoon. He refused every offer to blast open the earth. Instead, he and Keone established a respectful protocol. Scott would only harvest the fallen fruit, the loose crystals that had naturally detached from the cavern walls due to seismic shifts. He sold these few perfect stones at private auctions, raising millions without ever swinging a pickaxe. 5 years later, the barren wasteland of the Black Patch had been transformed. It was now known as the Greenstone Refuge. Wooden walkways floated above the sharp lava rock, allowing safe passage for the residents. The shack had been replaced by a sprawling, accessible lodge. Everywhere one looked, there were dogs. German shepherds, Malinois, Labradors, all of them retired military or police dogs with injuries or trauma, running freely or resting in the sun. Walking among them were veterans, men and women with their own scars, finding peace in the silence of the mountain. On the wide western porch, Scott Parker sat in a rocking chair. His face was more lined than before, but the haunted look in his eyes was gone. Resting his head heavily on Scott's lap was Gunner. The old dog had grown white around the muzzle, but his eyes were bright and his body was filled out and healthy, the pain in his hips managed by the best care money could buy. The sun began to dip below the cloud layer, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and violet. Scott reached into his pocket and pulled out a single, raw peridot crystal. He held it up to the dying light. As the sun vanished into the Pacific, the green stone caught the last ray, flashing with a brilliant, verdant fire. It was the color of life, enduring and defiant, even in the heart of the dead lands. They told Scott and Gunner they were broken, discarded, and worthless. But as their journey proves, the most precious treasures are often hidden beneath the roughest surfaces, waiting for someone brave enough to look deeper. Value is never about how the world sees you, but about the fire you refuse to let die. If this story of redemption touched your heart, please honor these old soldiers by sharing their journey or leaving your thoughts below. To keep walking this path with us, you can subscribe to our Brotherhood or simply click on that next video on your screen to discover another secret waiting to be found.